friends, and welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to go into my March monthly wrap up. So these are all of the books that I read in the month of March. I'm going to start off with going into some statistics, and then I will tell you some of my thoughts on each of the books. So I just wanted to mention that I had 8 books on my March TBR, so I read 3.5 of these, and I read 1 book that was not on my TBR. I had a little bit of a slumpy reading month this month, so it was a little bit of a struggle to get through some of these books. And I read a total of 4 books and 2 short stories. I read Strange Fascination by Julia Quinn, and The Annual, which was a bonus epilogue short story of one of the books that I read this month by Thea Hawthorne. I also read halfway into Go Tell the Bees That I'm Gone by Diana Gabaldon, but I was just really not feeling the book this month. I think some of my reads just were a little bit too much or too heavy at the beginning of the month, and that just kind of put me off reading a little bit later in the month, so hoping that that'll be different in April. Alright, so breaking down the genres of the books that I read. All of the books that I read this month were fiction, so I didn't read any nonfiction. I read 4 fiction books and 2 fiction short stories. One of the fiction books that I read this month was a young adult hard-hitting contemporary. I read 1 cozy sapphic fantasy. I read 1 young adult dystopian novel, which was a reread for me. And I read 1 contemporary sapphic romance with some magical realism. So I read a variety of genres this month. And I started 1 book from my top 25 books to read in 2025 list. And I finished 1 book from that list as well. And my shortest book of the month was a short story called A Reverie of Roses by Thea Hawthorne at 118 pages. And my longest book of the month was One Last Stop by McQuiston at 432 pages. In terms of the formats in which I read these books, I read them in 2 formats this month. I read primarily audiobooks, and then I read 1 ebook. So I read 3 audiobooks and 1 ebook, and 2 ebook short stories as well. In terms of some of the moods that I was reading in this month, a lot of it was very depressing, emotional, hard-hitting, and I think some of those moods were what were responsible for my bit of a reading slump this month. So I want to read some more lighthearted things. The first book that I finished this month was an audiobook. It was All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir. All My Rage is a story that takes place in 2 different timelines. So we're following a lady named Misbah and her child and his friend. So we follow Misbah in the past in Pakistan, and we are following the 2 children in the present. So they're teenagers in the present day living in California and kind of navigating their lives there and American society as the children of Pakistani immigrants, and Noor is also a Pakistani immigrant. So we have a lot of that perspective going on in here, and we get a lot of insight into how Muslim people are treated in the United States. Each character's perspective is told by a different narrator because I listened to this one on audio, so I feel like I got a lot out of that. And we alternate chapters, so one chapter would be told from Misbah's point of view, then the next chapter would be told from Noor's point of view and Sal's point of view, so they all alternated, all 3 of them. So we would pause where we were in one person's perspective and pick up where we left off in another person's perspective. There was a lot of societal reflection in this book, and reflection on how people view the Muslim community, how people view non-white people in society, and there was a lot of instances and kind of descriptions of abuse, substance misuse, and I thought it was really well depicted, but it was very hard to listen to. I had to take breaks and pause a lot while reading this, so it took me a while to get through this audiobook because it was just very tragic. And I think that it was a very much a character-driven story. I think that Sabaa really shined in this book with her characters. I don't think that the plot was anything spectacular or extraordinary, but you feel a lot of empathy for each of the characters, or at least I did, and a lot of horror for some of the things that happen to our main characters in this book. I like that we end on a slightly more hopeful note at the end, but it's clear that their lives are never going to be perfect, and I feel like that's a very realistic ending for this kind of story. This one was a super hard-hitting young adult contemporary story. Wow, I think this was one of the books that sent me into a little bit of a reading slump. It was very well written, but it was very difficult to read, I will say. I think it put a lot of strain on me, and you definitely have to be in the right headspace to read this one. There are so many different trigger warnings for this that I recommend you check them out before diving into this book, and it really didn't go in a way that I expected. It kept me surprised and on the edge of my seat at every turn. I just really thought that the story was well executed, but but I don't know if it could be one of my favorites for the month. I think it's very well written. I think it's my favorite in that sense of the writing style and just the way that Sabaa is able to describe her characters in this book. But as for favorite tonally, I don't think that this one kind of fits with that because it was so gloomy, but definitely an important read. So overall, I would say check out On My Rage, but if you are going to read it, definitely look into the trigger warnings and see if it's something that you can handle and make sure that you're in the right headspace for it. I think you'll get a lot out of the story if you're in the right headspace and if you don't find it too triggering. All right, the next book that I have to talk about is an ebook that I read, and it is A Reverie of Roses by Thea Hawthorne. Now, I was lucky enough to receive an early advanced reader copy for this, so thank you so much to the author Thea Hawthorne for the free copy. But all of my thoughts on this book are definitely my own, and I will say that this was such a lovely story. It was so atmospheric. It was a cozy fantasy, and it was pretty easy to get into. The fantasy aspects weren't too overwhelming in the story, I would say. I loved how the environment was described. You got so many detailed descriptions of just the surrounding environments, of what our main characters were wearing, what they look like, and you really felt like you could immerse yourself in the story. I also love that the main character is a painter, and I love reading about people who are very creative, so I liked seeing how she was struggling with her craft and how she ends up like improving throughout the story when she is able to reconnect with her true self. I felt like that was a very beautiful message to send to readers. And the story had a really interesting beginning with a fun concept. It starts off with this bet, which I think is really funny, and the story feels very refreshing. It doesn't feel like anything else that I've personally ever read, so I think you will get something new out of this for sure. I didn't like how some of the side characters treated our main character of Nora at the very beginning of the story, but this doesn't last very long, and we soon see that she understands what her true worth is, and she discovers her true self. So it's a little bit of a story of discovery and a little bit of a story of romance, but it's mainly focused on her struggles with trying to find her identity as a painter. In the story, it really felt like we were peeling back layers of an onion on the main character, which is really fun, and you would kind of start to understand more about her and her love interest as we got to know them a little more. I will say I definitely wanted more from this story. It is a little short as it was a novella, so I would love to know more about the characters, and I think that if we had had a little bit more time to develop the story, it could have been even better. And I also will say that I just didn't love how this was marketed as a sapphic romance. I think it's like a fantasy story of a person's journey coming to terms with themselves and trying to find themselves in their craft. And then the sapphic romance is like a side plot. So it wasn't a major plot. It didn't even start until like halfway into the story. So I wouldn't say that this is really romance full on, but it's more of a story of self-discovery. I just loved all the dreamlike and mystical aspects of this book. I highly recommend it just for that reason alone, and I think that you will just dive into it. It gave me a little bit of the feeling that I had when reading Anne of Green Gables, and I feel like there are very few books out there that give me that nostalgic kind of dreamlike feeling, and this kind of brought me back to that, so I definitely appreciate this story for doing that. The next thing that I finished this month was a short story called The Annual by Thea Hawthorne as well. This is just a little like second epilogue following the characters from A Reverie of Roses, and we get to see how far this main character has come in their painting prowess. They've made it into this like annual competition gallery thing, and it's a few pages long. It's only 2 to 3 pages, so I don't want to say anything else, but it's focused on that event, and I thought that was really cute to see. I love getting a little bit more of the characters because it felt like their stories were very unfinished at the end of the novella. The next book I read is Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. I also listened to this on audio because I don't have a physical copy of this book. I know, shocker, this is one of my favorite trilogies and I don't have a physical copy, but I will say that I do think that this is still the weakest book in the trilogy. I rank Catching Fires first, then The Hunger Games, and then Mockingjay. That's my order, and I just think that it's still my least favorite. I did appreciate it a lot more on this reread than I have other times that I've read this book, so I liked it the most this time, I think, but still not my favorite. For one thing, Mockingjay doesn't actually have a Hunger Games in it, and I think that the Hunger Games books that feature the games are definitely better. It's more of this rebellion and this uprising that's happening in the aftermath of events from the Hunger Games and Catching Fire, and this world is really at a climax, at a breaking point for what is going to happen with this country of Panem. So we see a lot of that going on. We see a lot of like the grassroots effort to take down the Capitol in this book, and I did understand and appreciate appreciate this time that human behavior is very cyclical and it comes in a pattern. Like, there's so much of that messaging throughout this book, and really at the end too, it hammers home that this might not be the last rebellion ever. Like, we are very cyclical creatures by habit. We have a very hard time breaking patterns, and things are bound to repeat themselves over and over again in history. So I appreciated that it drove that message home. And I will say that this whole series just makes you question your morals and your political views. There is so much political messaging in this series, and I can't wait to dive into Ballad and Sunrise on the Reaping to see what else Suzanne Collins has to say. There's a lot of nuance in these books, and I think that's part of the reason why I love them so much, because I think that I can get something new out of them almost every single time that I read them, and I view things in a different perspective, also depending on the political climate or things happening at the time of me reading. There were so many emotionally charged scenes in this one that touched me in a way that I hadn't felt other times when reading this book. I forget how much of Katniss's trauma also happens in this book. Even though she's not fighting in a Hunger Games this time, there's still traumatic things happening around her. There's a war going on with the whole society, so it's very, very difficult to read, and I did have a greater appreciation for just how much the characters go through in this one. I think that this is still an excellent trilogy. I would recommend this to everyone, and I love that this one had a little bit of hope infused at the end of it, especially considering just how very intense and dark the themes are from the Hunger Games and Catching Fire, as well as Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and Sunrise on the Reaping. I know that those are going to be devastating to me when I read them, so I love that there is still some hope for the future, some hope that things will improve thrown in at the end of this one, because this series really needed it. So I really appreciated that this time. I also had a newfound appreciation for how much Katniss is so much more aware of the political machinations going on around her. In the Hunger Games, she's just an innocent girl who doesn't really understand the politics at play, and she just wants to save her sister. And in Catching Fire, she now has a greater awareness that her actions have and do continue to have an effect on the people. And I appreciate though that she's very self-aware that she is being manipulated in this book in a way that she wasn't really aware in the first two books as much. And she's suspicious of everyone, as she should be in this world, because nobody has been there to help her or her family or her district even, and now suddenly District 13 is helping her people. She understands that there is probably a hidden motivation behind that, and she sees through President Coin in a way that I think very few other people have that came as refugees from District 12, because they just feel grateful that they've been taken in. But she's not very trustful in this book, and she has good reason to be mistrustful. And once she figures out what's happening to Peeta, I really felt for her. I felt so much empathy for her, because you really see how much she has lost to this point and how much more she loses in this book to get to our happily ever after, or happily for now, at the end of this book. All right, and then the last book that I finished this month was One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. I also listened to this on audio from Libro.fm, and I want to say a big thank you to Libro.fm for giving me this audiobook as part of their influencer program. The story follows a college student who's about 22 or 23 years old. Her name is August, and she's just moved to New York City. She's transferring to a university there because she's trying to find her place in the world. She's gone to college in a few different states and a few different places, and nowhere has felt right. So she's moving to New York to try it out there because she thinks that New York could be a good fit for her. And she doesn't really believe in anything magical. She only believes in very practical, pragmatic things that she can see with her naked eye. But she encounters this person who actually travels from the 1970s, I believe. So she is not from this time. So that's where the magical realism aspect of the story comes in. And I will say that I found this one to be quite disappointing, especially considering how much I loved Red, White, and Royal Blue. I really, really wanted to like this one. I thought the premise was super unique. I love that it's kind of like a stuck in time traveling aspect to it. I love that it's a sapphic romance. It had so many things going for it that it really could have been one of my favorite books of this year, but I just didn't love how it was executed. I felt that I really could not suspend my disbelief to the extent necessary to make this book really work for me, and I thought that was just so tragic considering how much I had loved the other book Casey McQuiston has written. I honestly don't know at this point if I want to read anything else written by Casey McQuiston, because I don't know if I really vibe with her writing if it's more like this book rather than Red, White, and Royal Blue. And I just also really didn't get how long it took August to realize that Jane was not from the modern day. Like, there were so many hints and signs, and I feel like she was being willfully oblivious to them because she didn't want to see it. There were so many reasons and so many things that she should have seen, that this girl's carrying around like an old cassette player and she doesn't know modern music, and there were so many little hints like that definitely showed that she was not from this time period. Like I mentioned before, I thought the premise was super unique. I loved the intrigue and mysteries at the start of this, and that's what really kept me going because I wanted to see how everything was going to play out. I really didn't know how she was going to resolve all the conflicts in this story, and I think that's why I pushed through. So I do like how the two mysteries in the story are kind of interconnected and mirror each other in a way, and I really can't go into anything more about that because I would be giving spoilers, but if you read this book or if you've read this book, you will absolutely understand what I mean. I loved also how drag queens were included in this book. I felt like it didn't really add a lot to the plot, but it was still a nice like little feature to include, and I loved seeing them in the background as characters. This is something that I really didn't expect, and it was just a fun little cameo. And this was my first foray into magical realism, so I don't know if just magical realism as a concept doesn't work for me or if it just didn't work in this book. So I'd be curious to try out a few other magical realistic books in the future to see how I feel about them. There were just so many things that just didn't like add up. I didn't think that the way that she wrote about the Q train in New York made a lot of sense. I was confused by some of the descriptions she had about this like hole or something. Like I just couldn't imagine it in my mind. And if I have a hard time visualizing the story, it means that I'm not going to connect with the story as much as I would otherwise. Also, I will say that there was a third act breakup in this book, so I found that super annoying. Like we were getting so close to the end and then they had to break up, and I didn't find the reason why they broke up believable. It just really didn't make sense. I strongly disliked how that played out. Third act breakups almost never work for me, and it didn't work in this instance either, and I felt like it was just unnecessary to the narrative as a whole. It was just creating drama for the sake of drama, and the ending also was wrapped up with almost such a perfect little neat bow that I found that infuriating as well too. I didn't like how that played out. I wasn't sure how this book was going to have a happily ever after, and I didn't like how it did it. I almost would have liked this more if it hadn't been a happily ever after, which I know is the point of a romance, but if the two of them had been separated and never gotten back together again, like, and the time travel stuff hadn't been like resolved in a way where they end up together, I would have liked that more. I think that would have been more interesting because it could have been chalked down to something that she hallucinated or something else like that, and I would have appreciated that more, making it a little bit more of a thriller vibe than a romance, because it just didn't do it for me the way that they were reunited. I think the most frustrating part of this book was that there were so many little things that worked for me that when the overall story didn't work for me, I just felt disappointed. I loved the little details. I liked Jane as a character. She was very fun, very relatable. I liked some aspects of August, and I could see myself a little bit in her character as well, and it just didn't come together for me. I didn't really have an issue with the romance, but I don't know. I didn't feel a lot of chemistry between the two of them. That might just have been me though, but it wasn't my favorite romance that I've ever read. I just felt like I couldn't get behind it because of the fantastical aspects of this book. That's what really detracted from it, to me at least. I can already feel my memories of this book fading so fast, and usually I feel like books linger with me at least a little bit. I have a bad memory, but they don't fade immediately. But I finished the book and I was like, what was this book even about? I had to like go back and set myself down and think to write my review before I could even remember all the details. So while I liked some aspects of the story, I felt like the whole was disappointing. Honestly, it wasn't worth all the hype that I was putting on this book before I read it, and it was a disappointing one from my 25 books to read in 2025. Definitely one that I think you can skip, and yeah, I don't think that this is one that anyone needs to read. There are much better sapphic romances out there, and even the one that I read earlier this month, I liked a lot more than this one, so I would definitely skip this one and read A Reverie of Roses instead. I like the fantastical aspects in that one and the sapphic romance in there much more. All right, and then the last book that I have to talk about for this wrap up is Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone by Diana Gabaldon. This is what it looks like. And yes, I took the dust jacket off of this right now because I don't like to read hardcovers when the dust jacket is on it. I'll put it back on when I'm done reading. I'm about halfway through. I think I'm a little bit more than halfway. Actually, I'm like 3/4 of the way through now that I'm looking at it. And this is the 9th and final book of the Outlander series, or at least the last one that has been published. She is currently working on the 10th book, and we don't know what the title of that one is yet, but I am so excited to be finally at an end with this series. I really wanted to finish this one in March, and I was a little disappointed that I didn't, but I think this was also part of the reason why I was in a little bit of a reading slump this month, because this is so long, and I will say that like nothing happened in the first 100 pages. Absolutely nothing happened, and then the first like 200 to 300 pages, like very little was happening. We were focusing on a lot of side characters that I just wasn't as invested in, but things were starting to get interesting a little bit farther into this book. At the point that I'm at, I'm intrigued in the stuff that's happening, so I can't wait to dive back into it. I've just been a little bit busy trying to finish up some other reads and doing some other things, so I just haven't had time to sit down and read this. But definitely one that I will be finishing in the month of April because I absolutely have adored this series, and I don't know that this one is going to be one of my favorites yet, but I'm reserving judgment until the very end. But you'll hear my full thoughts in my April wrap-up on this one. The last thing that I have to talk about is a short story called Strange Fascination by Julia Quinn. This was something that she recently included in one of her newsletters, and it's just a fun little Regency short story romance, and I had a fun time with it. It was super light-hearted and fun. Definitely something that I needed to read more of this month because of all of the hard-hitting things that I read. So I just had a great time with it. I don't remember too much about it, and I don't want to share anything else really about it because if you want to read it, it's available on her website for free. But I had a great time diving into it, and I just swooned while reading it, so definitely one that I recommend. Alright, so those are all 4 of the books that I read in the month of March, and the 2 bonus short stories, as well as the book that I am still currently reading. So I've tried to curate my April TBR to be a little bit more lighthearted and fun, and I have way too many books going on in there, but hopefully I will be more motivated to read that. I also think that I'm not going to try to force myself to stick so hard to my TBR in months going forward. I think it's just a fun thing to do, but trying to stick so closely to my TBR this month really hurt my reading a little bit. So I think for April, I just want to mood read a little more and see what happens. So that's all that I have for this video. If you like this video, give it a like, comment, and subscribe. I absolutely appreciate every single person that watches any one of my videos. I adore all of you. Thank you so much for watching, and I would love to hear any of your thoughts on the books that you read in the month of March. How many books did you read? What books did you love? What books did you hate? I'd love to hear any of your thoughts, and I will see you in the next one. So thank you so much for watching. Bye!